You can listen to the Canadian Gothic early and ad-free on Amazon Music. Include it with Prime.
You are listening to Canadian Gothic.
Hello, listeners. Tonight, we have a deeply unsettling and probably a bit surprising story to talk through. When we think of school shootings, most of us are picturing the United States. Columbine, Sandy Hook, Uvalde, the names have become synonymous with this American-style tragedy. But what many Canadians don't know is that the first modern-day school shooting happened here at home, and it contained all the hallmarks we would see repeated so many times in the United States and beyond. It happened in Brampton, Ontario, in the spring of 1975. Just as lunch break started, a 16-year-old student walked into the Brampton Centennial Secondary School carrying 2 rifles and a guitar case. The 5 minutes of terror that followed would end with 2 dead, 13 wounded, and an entire generation of students scarred. This is a heavy one. There's a lot to it. So let's get started. Tonight, in this episode of the Canadian Gothic, we'll discuss the story of Michael Slobodian and the 1975 Brampton High School shooting.
A young gunman armed with 2 automatic rifles wandered the halls of this school this morning, shooting at anyone that moved. Within 10 minutes, a teacher, a student, and the gunman were dead, and 14 students injured.
I remember when the shootings all began again, whatever, 6-7 years ago or whatever. I remember thinking, well, I wonder when Canada's going to start talking about Brampton, if they're going to remember it. And I thought I would keep looking, going, wow, why does no one talk about it? Oh, I guess they don't want to admit it. Go, well, that's what Americans do. We don't do that. But the truth is, it started here in 1975.
In the mid-1970s, Brampton was a much different place than the city we know it as here in 2025. Maple trees lined the streets, lawns were trimmed with care, and groups of kids on bikes were more common than traffic jams. The city hadn't yet turned into a sprawling suburb. It was smaller, simpler, and probably a lot safer. But let's zoom in on the family at the heart of this story. At 21 Whitehall Drive, the Slobodian family lived in a tidy bungalow. Peter and Lillian raised 4 children there, 3 boys and a girl. The youngest child, Michael, was 16 in spring of 75. Michael was a bit of a loner, a quiet kind of guy who would hardly get noticed in a group. He was into folk music, played a guitar that he was often seen carrying around in its case, and was starting to learn the drums. He dated a girl briefly in high school, but that didn't work out, but there's no big story there. The romantic side of that relationship ended amicably, and the 2 stayed friends. So when I say he's a bit of a loner, it wasn't that he was socially inept. He had friends. He just seemed to enjoy being alone with his thoughts more often than not. Classmates would go on to describe him as a quiet kid that didn't stand out and polite, a bit distant, and someone who didn't cause trouble. But in hindsight, there was also a darkness around Michael. What some described as quiet and polite, others saw as someone who was always watching from a distance. And there was no question Michael was also the author of some careful manipulation, and especially so at school. He was a smart kid and did well when he wanted to, but he also skipped classes, and he did it a lot. What may be most revealing is the way he tried to cover his tracks. He forged more than 30 excuse notes, and some of them were bizarrely creative. One of the final notes he passed a teacher read, "Please excuse Michael's absence from your class. He's contracted a blood disease which causes fevers and blisters on his hands. If you notice he's in an unusual state, please advise him to go home." It was almost absurd, but he managed to get away with it over and over again. Now, clearly this type of behavior suggests some issues below the surface. But the trouble extended beyond that. In the months before the incident at the Brampton High School, his family was dealing with several struggles. His father, Peter, had recently suffered back-to-back heart attacks and was scheduled for a major surgery in June. And just weeks before the incident at the school, Michael's grandfather had died, and the 2 were very close. Those issues, when combined with the endless stressors associated with life as a 16-year-old, began to weigh on Michael, and he wasn't dealing with it well. A week before the incident, he confided in a friend, "Everything is going wrong for me lately." Now, perhaps there was some unspoken reference to his family trouble, but what Michael had opened up to with his friend was the minutiae of teenage life. For one, his bike had recently been stolen. The second setback he was talking about was that his driver training lessons that he'd been looking forward to were canceled. But the biggest problem, in Michael's mind, was his performance at school. His sketchy attendance and his low to no effort approach was about to catch up to him. Michael's complicated relationship with two teachers specifically will become important, so let's spend some time on that. Ross Bronson was Michael's physics teacher. He'd been at the school for years, was a stickler for attendance, rules, and honesty. Michael had already failed a Mr. Bronson-led class, but was back for another shot, hopefully with better results this time. But it wasn't specifically physics class that would see Mr. Bronson and Michael butting heads in the lead-up to the tragedy. It was Michael's plans for a school science fair that Mr. Bronson was overseeing. Michael had planned a sort of Dr. Frankenstein meets frogs exhibit in which he planned to dissect a live frog, remove its heart, and then briefly revive the heartless frog by applying electrical shocks to its organs. Mr. Bronson rejected that idea outright. He told Michael it was unethical, it violated science fair standards, and involved unacceptable treatment of animals. Now, it seems obvious to me that this sort of thing wouldn't be allowed at a high school fair, but for whatever reason, the rejection really stung. Michael had told a friend he was so mad he could just kill him, which to most, of course, was just a figure of speech, but we'll get back to that. First, let's move on to the second teacher we need to meet. His English teacher was Miss Margaret Wright. In a way, she was the polar opposite of Mr. Bronson. She was just a new teacher in her mid-20s. This was in fact her first year. But she was basking in it. She was well-liked by the staff, and the students described her as warm, caring, and passionate about her job. Michael seemed to have respect for Mrs. Wright. He was comfortable enough to confide in her about his troubles at home. Not long before the shooting, he'd actually gone to her classroom in tears, opening up to her about his grandfather's death.
Wright was 25 years old, new to teaching, newly married, and planning on heading to Halifax at the end of the school year to settle down with her husband.
She was a young teacher. She was nervous. She was from outside. She was from the East Coast.
Now, before we get to how all this comes crashing down, and we're getting close, there's something else we need to know about Michael Slobodian. And this is certainly important, as at least in my eyes, it speaks to some sense of premeditation to what was soon going to unfold. In April, just 1 month before the tragedy that was about to play out in the high school, Michael joined the Lorne Scots, which is a local militia unit. If you're unfamiliar with them, as I'm sure 99% of us listening are, the Lorne Scots are a military reserve regiment based in southern Ontario. They provide part-time military training with a focus on soldiering skills, weapons handling, and field exercises. You can think of it as a more intense and more grown-up version of the Boy Scouts. Swap the knots and survival techniques for light infantry training. Typically, the training would occur in the evenings and the weekends, but Michael really embraced it and the military lifestyle. He started dressing in his military fatigues and wearing a beret, even when he wasn't training. And I should also say, at home, he had access to guns. His father kept rifles in the basement. They were a hunting family. So now we have the scene just about set. 16-year-old Michael was a bit angry, a bit fed up, going through it both at home and at school, and with an almost overnight switch to a military mindset, it's almost like a house of cards waiting to fall under the slightest breeze. And that would happen on Wednesday, May 28th of 1975. So before we get to it, let's take a short break, and when we get back, we'll hear the horrible way this house of cards collapses. Wednesday, May 28th, began like any other day. Blue skies and warm sun gave the students a preview of the summer break that was only a few long weeks away. Inside Brampton Centennial High School, Mrs. Margaret Wright too was looking forward to summer break. She was nearing the end of her first year of teaching, and up until now, it had all gone wonderfully. But there was still work to be done getting the kids through the curriculum. On the Wednesday morning in question, one of those students, Michael Slobodian's seat, was empty, again. And with very little time in the year, every class was going to matter if Michael wanted to avoid repeating the year. Mrs. Wright made the responsible but fateful decision to call the Slobodian house and explain to Michael's parents that attendance was critical at this point. It was a small routine act, a teacher simply doing her job, but that phone call was going to set the day in motion. At 10:40 a.m., during the school's recess, Michael walked into his house and was confronted by his mother, Lillian. She explained the phone call she just received from Mrs. Wright. He admitted it to his mom. He'd been skipping, and he promised to go back to school and get things on track after lunch. After what was probably an unpleasant conversation, Michael went upstairs to his bedroom, but instead of collecting his school books, he sat down at a desk and wrote the last note he'd ever write. To whom it may concern, my life is gone to pot. I'm going to eliminate certain people from this world. Those people are Mrs. Wright, Mr. Bronson, and any sucker who gets in my way. I'm then going to kill myself so as to not be imprisoned. I'm not insane. I'm just strictly fed up with life. I'm not getting anywhere, and it's all my fault. I love my parents, I love my family, and I know they love me. Michael left this note on his desk, put on his military jacket and green beret that he'd been wearing lately, but before he left the house, he did one last thing. He grabbed his guitar case, but rather than using it to take his guitar, he filled it with two of his father's rifles, a .22 caliber semi-automatic and a .444 lever action. With guitar case in hand, he walked the couple blocks back to school and arrived just as lunch break was beginning. Michael entered through the school's main doors and walked calmly down the busy hall before ducking into the boys' washroom on the first floor. Inside, a group of students were at the sinks talking. Among them was John Slinger, Michael Gabolt, and Richard Shadrach. With guitar case in hand and dressed in his fatigues, Michael walked past the group and stepped into a stall. Inside, he opened the guitar case, pulled out 2 ammo belts which he tossed over each shoulders, creating a violent X-shaped vest across his chest, and then he loaded each of his rifles. He slung the larger but slower .444 over his shoulder for later, firmly grasped the .22 semi-automatic, and opened the door of the stall. When he stepped out, he immediately raised the .22 and fired into the crowd of boys at the sink. John Slinger, only 17, was hit first. The 2 wounds to his chest were so severe he immediately fell to the floor and likely passed away before realizing what had even happened. 16-year-old Michael Gaboreau and 19-year-old Richard Shadrach were also hit and injured severely, but as they fell to the floor and the echo of the gunshots rang through the halls, Michael stepped out of the bathroom, bringing the tear next to the hallways of Brampton High School. As he entered the busy halls, he was surrounded by students working their ways towards the cafeteria or towards the front doors, planning to enjoy their lunch in the spring air. Just like in the bathroom, without saying a word, Michael raised his .22 and began to fire down the hall. It took more than a moment to sink in. No one understood what they were hearing. And in 1975, before Columbine and its endless sequels, why would they? One student who witnessed the first shots, Sylvia Meister, said that she thought it was part of an elaborate history class project. Another, Pam Reed, thought it was part of a film project. And Maureen Abraham believed someone was setting off firecrackers. But then they, and so many others, saw what was happening. Michael, in his military fatigues, eyes as cold as ice, with smoke curling from his rifle's barrel.
I turned, I saw a guy with a rifle, and he turned towards and shot down the hall towards the art room, and then towards the washrooms in the middle of the hall. And then I was running by then, and I heard another shot, and I turned around, and there was one guy shot in the elbow, and he was running behind me, dripping blood.
I heard a whole bunch of girls screaming, and I turned around and looked down at this guy. He come out of the washroom, and he knelt down and he started shooting. Then I just started to run with the rest of the girls.
Someone came into the cafeteria and she announced that she'd been shot. So I thought, now, what is going on here? I went straight to the door of the cafeteria to find out what the heck was going on. But as I approached the door, I thought I smelled blood.
As panic exploded and the school's halls quickly filled with smoke, Michael continued to fire towards the fleeing students. Some ran outside, others found hiding spaces. Fellow student Scott Thompson, who would later find fame as a cast member in The Kids in the Hall, was saved by a teacher pulling kids into the classroom.
I guess I think it was around 11:30, something like that. And I was racing to class. I remember saying, what's going on? And someone said, he's got a gun. A door opened to my left, and it was Mr. Atkinson, I believe. And he said, get in here. He might have sworn. swore. And he might have said, "Get the fuck in here," or "Get the hell in here," or whatever. I'd never heard a teacher swear, so I knew it was serious.
As Michael slowly strolled the halls, his shots and their screams echoing the corridors, it was almost as if he was looking for something or someone. And since we've all heard about the note he left at his desk in his bedroom, we can take a pretty good guess about who that was. When Michael encountered Mrs. Wright, the 20-something English teacher that was on the phone with his mother just over an hour prior, she was standing near the doorway of her classroom, likely looking down the hall trying to understand what was happening. Kids in her class described seeing Michael almost slide to a halt in front of her door as the two came face to face.
He looked at her. She said, "Michael, what are you doing?"
As soon as the words were leaving her mouth, Michael dropped his .22 semi-automatic rifle to the ground in favor of using his much more powerful .444 that up until now had been strung over his shoulder. As he raised the barrel, she turned to run, which resulted in her being shot in the back with a high-powered weapon from close range. The bullet barely slowed as it passed through her. As she fell to the ground, that same bullet went on to hit one of the children in her classroom.
When I saw the fire come out of the muzzle, well, I'd grown up with guns. I went for the floor.
By diving, he avoided getting hit in the chest too, and probably saved his own life, though he was still badly hurt.
I started to make my way for cover at the back of the room, which I'm not sure what was all that smart anyway. I mean, I obviously left a trail behind me as to where I was going.
Mrs. Wright was also bleeding heavily.
There was a part of me that said, you know, you need to go over and help her, or try and help her, console her. And then there was another part of me that was just, you need to survive, you need to stay alive.
With Mrs. Wright on the ground, beginning her unsuccessful fight for her life, Michael would simply walk off, continuing down the hall. But for reasons we will never know, Michael stopped walking, raised the high-caliber rifle and pointed it to his own head and pulled the trigger. Less than 5 minutes after he walked out of the stall, Michael's body hit the ground, just as police began converging on the school.
He never made it to Bronson's classroom.
I had no idea at the time that the event was happening that I was his next victim.
Were you having any problems with Michael?
None that I would regard as large enough to merit putting my name on a list. His attendance was irregular, and I had spoken to Michael on occasions about his attendance. Those were the only problem areas.
As police worked their way through the smoke-filled hallways, checking rooms for the dead and injured, students were being led out single file, many right past Michael's body and the firearms that surrounded it. During the evacuation, there's a very tragic coincidence that I have to mention. Mrs. Wright, who was laying on the floor in her classroom, severely injured, was being cared for by an adult who was enrolled in the school's mature student program. When that student, Pat Slinger, heard the screams from Mrs. Wright's class, she came running and supported the dying teacher until paramedics took over. But here's the coincidence. While Pat Slinger was helping hold Mrs. Wright's wound shut, her son John was dying in the bathroom. He was the first victim of the day. In the end, there would be 3 dead: Michael Slobodian, the shooter, John Slinger, and first-year teacher Mrs. Wright. Additionally, the attack would leave 13 wounded by gunfire. And all things considered, it's an absolute miracle that this wasn't much worse.
I was working I was the emerge physician on duty that day.
Dr. Jim Cairns had recently arrived from Northern Ireland, where even as a young doctor he had already seen more than his fair share of gunshot wounds. On what had been a sleepy day at the hospital, more than a dozen people from Brampton Centennial flooded the emergency room. Though Margaret Wright had been shot at point-blank range, she was still alive.
She was awake and talking to us, yes. And obviously, for the sake of her family, I wouldn't like to go into details, but because she was like that, a lot of physicians felt we should be able to save her, and unfortunately, because of the severity of the wound, it was impossible to do so.
The shooting ended at about 11:30 a.m. on Wednesday. The janitorial and custodian staff spent the weekend cleaning up the broken glass and the bloodstains, and in what would be unimaginable today, the following Monday morning, classes resumed.
The shooting happened on a Wednesday. We took Thursday and Friday off. We were back at school on Monday. No grief counselors, nobody. I remember coming past his house, and you could hear Michael's mother inside wailing, and you could hear all over the neighborhood.
The principal addressed the students over the intercom that morning with a solemn message acknowledging the enormity of what had happened, while admitting that they may likely never know why it happened. Then the bell rang, and classes began. It's simply unimaginable, but at that time, this was seen as a freak, one-of-a-kind occurrence, and people were still learning how to respond to this unique type of trauma. The Brampton High School shooting is seen as the first modern school shooting in Canada, but when viewed in a present-day lens, it's easy to see similarities between many of the tragic events that will follow. Michael Slobodian fit a pattern that wouldn't become recognizable until decades later. A young man angry at authority, obsessed with weapons, unable to tolerate failure, and unwilling to accept responsibility. But in 1975, there was no language for this. There was no school shooter archetype and no playbook for how a community should respond. And that's maybe why this story faded. Not because people forgot, but because they didn't know how to remember. I want to thank you for joining me here on the Canadian Gothic. I'd like to send my deepest condolences for everyone affected by this tragic story and the many, many stories like it that continue to play out in Canada and beyond. If there's a lesson in this, I suppose it's to listen and pay attention to those around you. Violence can strike anytime, but often there are unactioned red flags that were waved in the calm before the storm. Now, with that said, I'm going to start wrapping up this episode, but before I do, let me end with some thanks. First, a big thanks to Linz from the Dystopian Simulation podcast, who provides our intro and outro voiceovers, and Monty Datta, who contributes the music for this show. And then lastly, but most importantly, a massive thank you to everyone listening, as without your interest and your support, the Canadian Gothic would be as pointless as it would be impossible. Now, on the topic of support, let me thank the newest subscribers to our premium feed. Jeremy, Vlad, and Jenna, thank you for going premium. And for anyone else who'd like to support the show, you can help us out here in a variety of ways. First of all, a premium feed subscription costs just a couple bucks a month, and that money funds the creation of new episodes. But the premium feed will also give you those episodes 2 days early, give them to you ad-free, and give you access to a back catalog of episodes. If that sounds like something you're interested in, you can go premium at thecanadiangothic.com/subscribe. And even if you don't want to go premium, you can still support the show by sharing this episode on social media and recommending it to your friends. Your support is very much appreciated. So until next time, let me remind you to take care of each other, hug your loved ones tight, and let me know if you see anything weird.
Thank you for listening to Canadian Gothic.
As Brampton emerged from its shock, questions about the killings began. First, who was the killer? Reporters descended on the Slobodian house, and in a bizarre choice, the family sent Michael's younger sister, Datta, out to answer the barrage of questions.
Was he having any difficulty at school?
Just with English.
Was he angry with anybody in particular?
No,
Do you know of anything that could have sparked this incident?
not a thing. He's perfectly normal, you know.
In 1975, if you were 16, you could order a shotgun out of a catalog or pick one up at a sporting goods store. Even a big game rifle like a .444.
How can a schoolboy get a hold of a weapon like this? Don't tell me you can go in and buy a weapon like this. Surely they're restricted. Surely there are tight restrictions on them. And there wasn't.
What kind of guy was he?
He's a pretty good guy. He's normal like anybody else. Like, he seemed fine to me.
From what I knew of him, he'd be just like your average type of teenager, I guess. Same ideas, but he's really more quiet than anybody else.
Is he the kind of guy that you would have thought would walk into a school with a gun and shoot up the place?
No, I didn't think he had it in him at all to do anything like that.